Welcome to Reformed Thinking. For this deep dive, you've brought us a text that is, well, it's just electric. It literally shouts with triumph. We're looking at Psalm 47.
It is an incredible piece of scripture, and for our source material, we're drawing from excerpts of Charles Spurgeon's commentary, The Treasury of David.
Which is always a great place to start. And our mission today is pretty straightforward. We want to take this amazing song and really unpack it. We'll look at the calls to worship, try to get a handle on the nature of the king being described, and then see what that means for the church.
Yeah, that's the goal. And this psalm, it's a hymn of victory, of universal kingship. You could look at its immediate historical setting. Maybe it was about the Ark of the Covenant being moved or some military win.
Right, a specific event.
A specific event. But Spurgeon makes it clear, and I think he's absolutely right, that the spiritual subject here is so much bigger. It's about the present sovereignty of God, Jehovah, and it points directly to the victories and the ascension of the Lord Jesus Christ.
And that's really why it hits home for us, isn't it? The whole idea of a universal kingdom, a single sovereign king over everything. That's just central to how we understand God's work in the world.
It is. And before we even get into verse 1, we have to look at the title, A Psalm for the Sons of Korah. Spurgeon himself leans very strongly toward David being the author. He says it has that distinct ring of David's compositions.
So the Sons of Korah aren't the writers.
No, they were the choir, the singers, the ones designated to lead the people in this song.
And the history there, the history of the Korahites, that adds a whole other layer to this. I mean, it makes the whole thing so much richer.
It really does.
You have this glorious, universe-spanning song of triumph. And it's given to the descendants of Korah, the man who led a rebellion against Moses and Aaron and was literally swallowed by the earth for it.
That is the theological frame for the whole piece. It's amazing when you think about it. Their family history starts with this catastrophic rebellion and judgment. But their descendants, they aren't just spared. They're given one of the highest honors in the temple, leading the entire world in this shout of triumph for the king.
It changes everything. The hymn isn't just about a national victory anymore. It becomes a monument to sovereign grace. The praise is coming directly from the lips of those who were rescued by that grace.
It's a constant reminder that God's choice, his act of restoration, that's what even makes our worship possible.
Yeah, it really raises the stakes. We aren't singing because we did something to earn the win. We're singing because he won, and then he rescued us so we could be part of the party.
Exactly.
Now, for structuring our deep dive today, Spurgeon suggests a really simple, clean break right after verse 4. The first part, verses 1 to 4, it's all about these initial calls to praise and the declarations of God's sovereignty. It lays the groundwork.
And then verses 5 through 9, it shifts. It moves to the triumphant ascension and what that means for everyone, everywhere. The universal application.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. That first call to universal exaltation, verse 1 just jumps right in with this very physical, very immediate command. Oh, clap your hands, all ye people. Shout unto God with the voice of triumph. I mean, these are raw, natural signs of joy. This isn't quiet or subdued. It's meant to be loud.
This is faith finding its physical voice.
Oh,
It's
wow.
almost a necessary release, a celebratory outburst. We're called to use the most enthusiastic expressions of joy we have because of who the Lord is and what he's done.
And Spurgeon notes that God is fine with that. He accepts this kind of demonstrative joy as long as it's coming from a sincere heart.
That's right. But the thing that immediately jumps out is the scope. All you people.
Yeah, it's not just Israel.
Not at all. The Gentiles are explicitly invited, commanded to join in this triumphal march. The vision here is huge from the get-go. It's every nation.
And because it's for everyone, the action has to be something everyone can do.
Exactly. Spurgeon's insight here is great. He says, look, they can't all speak the same language. That's a result of Babel.
Yeah.
So the symbolic action of clapping hands, that's a universal expression. It cuts across all those language barriers.
So clapping is understood everywhere as applause, celebration, agreement.
Yes.
It's a picture of humanity's unity being restored, all brought together in this one physical act of acknowledging the one true king. It's almost like a theological reversal of Babel, all happening because of Christ's reign.
Absolutely. But the direction of the praise is critical. It is unto God. It has to be universal, but it also has to be undivided. When we shout with triumph, that sound has to match the amazing victories that only a great king could pull off.
I think the commentaries are really helpful here for balancing how we think about worship. You have Matthew Henry, for instance, who encourages us to accept these kinds of outward acts. He says God accepts the strength of the feeling more than the weakness of the expression, as long as the heart is in the right place.
Which gives a lot of grace for how different people express joy.
It does, but then you get the necessary counterbalance from someone like John Neal. He suggests that the real voice of melody should be our deeds more than our words.
Our obedience.
Right. Our actual lives should be the sound that praises God. It's a subtle but really important reminder that the clapping has to be sincere and the shouting needs to be backed up by a life of faithful submission. Our external actions have to reflect an internal reality.
That makes perfect sense. And that universal praise in verse 1 leads us straight into the character of the king who deserves all of it in verse 2. This is where the theological weight really starts to settle in.
It is. For the Lord Most High is terrible. He is a great king over all the earth.
So verse 2 gives us the rock-solid foundation for all this joy. For Jehovah, the self-existent, the only God, Most High, is terrible. He's lofty, wise, and glorious.
We have to stop and unpack that word, terrible. In our modern ears, it just means awful or dreadful. If our goal is intelligent worship, we can't just let that modern definition sit there.
No, we have to put our theological lens on right away. The king is terrible. But this terror is not meant to cause dread among his own people. It's actually the reason for their triumph, for their security.
Okay, so explain that.
Well, his omnipotence is terrible to his enemies. It has the power to crush them. But for his subjects, that same power is what protects them. It's almighty for their defense.
That's the key distinction, then. Spurgeon uses this analogy of loyal subjects watching a grand review of their prince's troops. They're filled with triumph, with pride. Why? Because their king is so powerful, so able to defend them, and so feared by his enemies, the terror is pointed outward.
Right. If you are under his protection, that terror is your ultimate safety net. It gives you stability. John Boyes explains that Christ is terrible in justice, so he is feared by his children for their good through discipline, but also by the wicked for their inevitable punishment.
So the word has a huge scope of meaning. This king is terrible to the devil, who knows and fears his authority. He's also terrible to hypocrites, who fear his justice, knowing he's coming to purify things.
So the fear of this king is the beginning of wisdom for his people. It leads to reverence and awe. For his enemies, though, the terror is just pure dread of righteous judgment.
And this overwhelming power leads right into the second half of the verse, the scope of his rule. He is a great king over all the earth. This is where that universal kingship we hold to really takes center stage.
This is direct refutation of any idea of a small, local God. He's the sole monarch of all lands, the King of Kings. Spurgeon really emphasizes this. He says his dominion includes every little hamlet, every city, every remote island. Nothing is outside of his sovereign rule.
He governs it all now through providence, but the psalm is also looking forward. George Horne points out that it's looking to the full realization of this in the person of Jesus Christ.
Exactly. When Christ ascended, he became terrible to his enemies, having all power in heaven and on earth. He displayed the majesty of a truly universal kingdom.
So this claim, right here in this psalm, it puts the entire world under the spiritual and governmental claim of Jesus Christ. It's a declaration that his reign is total.
And that's why the call for the nations to submit and rejoice is so urgent. If they were wise, they'd submit right now and start clapping their hands, excited to be ruled by such a just and sovereign king. Which, of course, leads us right into the implications of that submission in the next section.
Right, from the universal to the personal.
Verses 3 and 4. And verse 3 immediately spells out what the king's universal reign means for his people. He shall subdue the people under us and the nations under our feet.
Now, that language, subdue under our feet, it sounds very martial, very aggressive.
It does, but the key is the agent. He shall subdue. The victory, the battle, it all belongs to the Lord. This is a promise given to his church.
So it's not a questionable war, it's a guaranteed outcome.
That's right. The church can feel discouraged because the fight against unbelief and worldliness seems to go on forever. This verse is a promise that truth and righteousness will win out in the end. Even the most rebellious hearts will eventually submit to conquering grace.
And the triumph is described as decisive, the nations under our feet. It speaks of a total reversal. Historically, God's people were often the ones being persecuted, the ones underfoot. This looks to a time when that's flipped, and the church becomes this great monarchy through Christ's spiritual victory.
But we have to be so careful with that imagery. In a historical context, under our feet could sound like a call for worldly domination, for revenge. And that's where commentators like Matthew Poole provide such needed clarity.
What does he say?
He says this subjugation is not punitive, it's for the good of the ones being subdued.
Ah, so it's a restorative victory, an evangelistic one.
Exactly. It gives the subdued people opportunities and encouragement to worship the true God, which is what leads to their real, lasting happiness. The nations are conquered by grace, not by armies.
So the victory is really the successful spread of the gospel. The Gentiles are subdued by the preaching, and they are, in a sense, brought under the apostles, the Jewish messengers, by being brought into the family of Christ.
Yes. Thomas Wilcox makes that so clear. He says being under our feet means the Gentiles become the students and the Jews become the teachers, sitting at the feet of those who brought them the message of salvation. The subduing of the nations is their conversion to the truth.
So verses 1 through 3 cover this big, external, universal joy and triumph. But then verse 4 brings it all inward. It demands a really deep, personal response to this huge truth. He shall choose our inheritance for us.
This is a radical shift in focus. It moves from clapping hands to an act of total surrender. And this act of just submitting our will, our choices, our desires completely to Him, that might be the highest spiritual form of praise in the whole psalm.
You know, in our culture, the idea of self-determination, of making your own choices, is seen as the highest good. This verse is so countercultural. It demands that we show we believe He's a great king by putting ourselves, our futures, our entire lives at His disposal.
We have to empty our hands of self-care and self-planning so that our hands are free to be used for His honor. And that is so hard to do in practice. We're afraid of the unknown inheritance. We fear that God's choice for us will be less satisfying than the one we had planned for ourselves.
That fear of the unknown is very real. But Spurgeon talks about how the believer finds rest by casting all their care on God. I mean, if we have a king who is terrible in power and most high in wisdom, why would we ever think our own flawed choice is better than his perfect plan?
That's the whole point. William Secker has this wonderful story about a woman who was asked if she was willing to live or die, and she just replied, whichever God pleases. And when they pressed her, asking what she would choose, she said, truly, I would just refer it back to Him again.
Wow.
The person whose will is submitted to God gets their will from God.
That's a powerful picture of just restful trust. If we really trust the king, we stop trying to dictate the terms of our own lives.
And Secker has this pointed warning that really sticks with you. He says, never were any their own carvers, but they were sure to cut their own fingers. We are so often guilty of trying to grab the carving knife, hoping to get the best piece for ourselves, only to find we've hurt ourselves because we just don't have the wisdom the king has.
I can definitely relate to that. Looking back at times in my life where I tried to force a career path or a relationship, and my best efforts were just so short-sighted compared to how Providence actually worked things out. We should be like vessels in a house, just standing ready to be filled or emptied as the owner pleases.
And this submission is justified because of the quality of His choice. He chooses the excellency of Jacob, whom He loved. God chose the portion for His ancient people, and He will choose ours. Our real beauty, our boast, our best treasure is having a God like that, who manages our affairs because He loves us.
This also speaks to difficult life circumstances, doesn't it? Giles Fletcher makes a really sobering point about our earthly situation. He says if you're godly but poor, you can't possibly know if you would remain godly if you weren't poor, right?
God knows us better than we know ourselves, and He can best fit the estate to the person.
That's the highest form of an excellent choice. It's the choice that perfects the person, not just the circumstances around them. It's a choice designed for our sanctification.
And right at that moment of deep personal surrender, the psalm just pauses. Selah. It's a moment for holy meditation. The text just demands that we stop, leave our portion to God's sovereign will, and just rejoice in the relationship. He is thine and thou art His. It's a moment of quiet, absolute trust before the whole thing ramps up again with the king's return. That quiet moment of Selah ends pretty dramatically in verse 5. God has gone up with a shout, the Lord with the sound of a trumpet. It feels like the command to shout from verse 1 is now being reported as a fulfilled fact, a reference to Christ's ascension. It transports us right to the moment the conqueror returns to glory. The battle is over. The victory is won. The shout and the trumpet, they signify the splendor of His triumph as He leads captivity captive. It was the only fitting way to welcome a victorious king back from the wars with martial music and acclamation from angels and glorified spirits.
And it's God in our nature, in human form, that has gone up to heaven. Isaac Ambrose reminds us that Christ didn't just ascend for himself, but for us. He was acting as a public person. So whatever he accomplished in his ascension, we have a part in it.
Mm-hmm.
When we think about our head soaring up to glory, every member of the body should respond with praise.
And that link between the past event and our future hope is so important. Christopher Wordsworth pointed out that Origen, way back, suggested that the mention of the shout and the trumpet connects the ascension with what's still to come. Our thoughts are carried forward to Christ's return for the final judgment.
So the sound that marked his return to glory is the same sound that assures us of his future return in power. After that really dramatic scene of Christ's return, verses 6 and 7 bring the focus back to us, back to the church's required response. It's a mandate for ongoing, thoughtful praise.
The repetition in verse 6 is just. It's arresting. Sing praises is repeated 5 times. It's meant to be a rebuke to our spiritual laziness, to stress how earnest and frequent and joyful our worship should be. The King never stops being good, so we should never stop being grateful.
And the object of that praise is specified. Sing praises unto our King. Jesus is worthy of all of it. His sovereignty is the source of our gladness, and singing is the fitting homage for such a monarch. We pay our tribute in songs of joy, not groans of duty.
And that command is backed up by the universal scope we see again in verse 7. For God is the King of all the earth. This was a truth that the Jews of Jesus' day really struggled with. They wanted to keep God's kingdom to themselves.
Right, a very narrow perspective.
A very narrow perspective. And the psalmist corrects it immediately. Jehovah's providential throne governs every single event, which guarantees that the gospel promises will be fulfilled for all nations through the Messiah.
John Trapp captures that thought perfectly. He says something like, "Our King," said I, "that's too small. He is King of all the earth." And that huge vision requires a certain quality of worship, which brings us to the core command. Sing praises with understanding.
This is so central to acceptable worship and a real hallmark of Reformed theology. Spurgeon warns us against the idea that just any sound, no matter how nice it is enough. Worship has to be thoughtful, intelligent. We have to appreciate the reason for the song.
The Hebrew word used there is mashil, which is often translated as instruction or didactic. It implies sound doctrine. It's an explicit call for our minds to be engaged in worship.
It means we have to prioritize the content, the theology, over the music itself. A tune might excite the senses, but it's the truth of what we're singing that has to affect the heart. And the heart, our spiritual faculty, is what God is primarily interested in.
This is so relevant for us today. We have to be careful not to mistake a purely sensory delight in beautiful music or a grand building for a genuine spiritual impulse. We can end up offering God songs that are designed more for human amusement than for his acceptance if we neglect the theological content.
And this focus on understanding creates a really strong theological contrast. John Wells argues that if we don't understand what we're singing, it shows a careless spirit or a hard heart, and it makes the whole service pointless. He contrasts that with the practice, like the papists that Davidic cites, of singing in an unknown tongue. God will not accept a service that the worshiper doesn't even understand themselves.
That's the real test for worship, isn't it? Is the intellect engaged? We have to sing wisely if we want to sing gratefully. The worship of the King of all the earth requires the highest faculty. He gave us our minds to be enlightened by the Holy Spirit and applied to the truth of the song. We're not seeing dimly anymore, so our praise should reflect the full reality of what we know about the King who has ascended.
Yes, singing a didactic psalm, a song that's just loaded with sound doctrine, praises God most effectively because it appeals to the mind and the spirit.
As the psalm comes toward its end, the focus goes back to the security and the essential character of this universal rule. Verse 8 says, "God reigneth over the heathen, God sitteth upon the throne of his holiness."
That opening statement, God reigneth over the heathen, establishes a vital present reality. Even in nations defined by idolatry and spiritual darkness, God is still in control. He maintains a secret, overruling governance. This is where faith can find its rest, knowing his providential throne guides everything, even the chaos, to guarantee his promises will be fulfilled.
And the nature of that rule is defined by where he's sitting, upon the throne of his holiness. This is the great assurance for the believer. His throne is undisputed, but even more than that, every single decree, every act, every command that comes from it is holiness itself. It's never stained by injustice or sin.
Divine sovereignty, in a Reformed view, is never arbitrary. It's completely inseparable from divine holiness. If God were sovereign but not holy, we would have reason for genuine crippling fear. But because his throne is one of perfect righteousness, we know his omnipotence is always used justly.
The king's posture also says a lot. He sits in serenity. He's unmoved, undismayed. He knows his own power. He knows his purposes will be accomplished. He's not stressed out by what's happening on earth. That assurance that the king is sitting securely on a throne of pure holiness is reason enough for the most enthusiastic song.
That serenity is the direct result of his absolute inherent holiness. The governance of the entire universe is in the hands of one whose will is always and eternally good.
And the final verse, verse 9, brings this universal scope right down into the political sphere. It details the ultimate submission of earthly powers. The princes of the people are gathered together. The prophetic vision sees the rulers of the world becoming willing subjects.
The vision is so grand. It's not just the poor or the common people who submit, but the nobles, the rulers, the heads of state. All majesties have to recognize and own Jesus as far more majestic than they are, bowing their willing necks to Christ's spiritual rule. It points to a future time when the great people of the nations will be regenerate people serving the true King.
And this gathering connects right back to the covenant with Abraham. Even the people of the God of Abraham. This is the fulfillment of that ancient promise. In thee and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed.
The gathering arm of the great shepherd king here just obliterates the dispersion that was caused by Babel. But the identity of Abraham's people is so important here. Lancelot Andrews clarifies they are not just the physical descendants, the children of the flesh, they are the children of the promise, the ones who grab hold of that promise by faith.
They have the same spirit of faith that Abraham had. And that faith-based definition has to include the Gentiles, even those who used to worship idols. I mean, John the Baptist made that exact point, saying God could raise up children for Abraham from stones. The people who were spiritually dead are now raised up by faith to be the children of Abraham.
And the conclusion of the psalm wraps up the totality of this submission with a really powerful metaphor. For the shields of the earth belong unto God.
What are the shields? There are a couple of ways to see that, right?
There are. Bishop Edward Reynolds suggests the shields are the protectors of the commonwealth, the magistrates, the rulers, and the metaphor gives them both dignity, because they're above others, and duty to protect others.
So if these rulers are God's shields, they get their authority from him and they owe him their loyalty. Joseph Carroll says they're called shields, not shield bearers, to show that protection is essential to their office. They're meant to be merciful, strong, honorable instruments for defending the people.
But then John Calvin offers a broader, maybe simpler view, which a lot of people prefer. He says God himself is the ultimate defender of the world, and the use of the plural, many shields, points to the fact that because of the innumerable dangers threatening the world, God's providence has to intervene in all sorts of ways, using many different bucklers.
So whether the shields are human rulers or God's wider providence, the final message is the same.
It is. All principalities and powers must be subject to him, because he is greatly exalted in nature, in power, in character, and in glory. The King who ascended is the absolute source of all legitimate authority and protection on earth.
There is no one who compares to him, and that's the final crescendo. That's the reason for the universal shout. This deep dive into Psalm 47, pulling from Spurgeon and Henry and Secker, has given us such a glorious picture of the King. We started with a call for universal, enthusiastic, praise-clapping, shouting, and we ended with the ultimate submission of all creation and all earthly authority to this glorious, holy, and sovereign King.
And all the parts of the psalm are so tightly connected. Christ's ascension is the historical guarantee that the church will be victorious in the world. And that victory, which is won by the gospel, ensures the King's universal rule in both providence and grace.
And the response required from you, the listener, it's not passive, it's active. We're called to physical joy in verse 1 and then to intellectual submission in verses 4 and 7. The King is majestic and terrible in his righteous power, but his rule is so gracious and wise that we should eagerly surrender our inheritance, our choices, to his will, and we should worship him intelligently with mashal.
For you, the learner, this psalm is almost a shortcut to understanding that God's sovereignty isn't just a philosophical idea. It's righteous, it's inevitable, and it is entirely for the good and the sanctification of his people and those he draws to himself. It is the most stable truth you can find in an unstable world.
Spurgeon ended his notes with this excited command. Make haste, ye wheels of time. The vision of Christ's universal reign is glorious, and we look forward to it with real eagerness.
But we have to operate in the meantime. And here's the thought to leave you with. If true worship requires understanding, and if the highest homage we can pay is submission, leaving our inheritance to God's choice, then how does actively leaving our daily affairs, our next decisions, our next efforts, in His hands. Today, prepare us for that great final shout when the King returns. It's one thing to sing about ultimate sovereignty when we're reflecting on the past or looking to the distant future. It's a completely different thing to practice that submission when you're faced with an immediate choice this afternoon, and you have to sacrifice your own will for His wise and holy plan, that daily surrender. That's the true measure of our belief in the King of all the earth.